groups like mine and others have done to focus on this issue. So I think people are slightly more conscious of it, but I think there's no question that when you do look at the polling, there's quite a bit more to go.
And I'd say, look, if you just look at the current conflict in Gaza, I had a piece that appeared last week, is actually still running on some websites, on just the Washington Post's coverage of the conflict. I mean, intensely human stories of the Israeli side. They're afraid. They're running for cover. They need shelter. These two young boys killed. They listened to reggae music when they were young. They were full of life and joy, etc. The Arabs were presented as a body count, at best, a body count. And when they were presented in a graphic portrayal of it, it was almost a full third of a page with little stick figures, with the Palestinian babies being little tiny red stick figures and the men being little larger black stick figures. And of course there were 129 little red stick figures, but no ages, no names, no interviews with the mothers, no stories about who they were and what kind of life they wanted to live and the hope that they had for the future, as was the case on the few casualties that existed on the Israeli side. I mean, every loss of human life is tragic, but some become more tragic when you can understand them, identify them, get inside their skin and feel their pain. On the other side, if they're presented as an objectified mass, there's no empathy, there's no feeling that they're people like me. Today, for the first time in the Washington Post, he had a front page story, continued on over on the inside, that actually told stories, actually gave ages and names, actually interviewed parents, actually allowed you to feel their sympathy. That has to happen all the time, and it doesn't. It doesn't. And as Matt said, you know, I mean, Ahmed gets up in the morning and has a cup of coffee and goes to deliver two babies. It's not a story. But when Ahmed straps a bomb to himself and does something, then it's a front page story. So the obvious impact is that all Arabs are, and as far as Arab Americans go, I mean, it simply is not an interesting story, I guess, to tell about who we are and what we do and how our lives are pretty much the American dream played out in everyday life. It ought to be. It certainly would go a long way to changing some of the dynamic, but that's one of the things we do. And Matt, in his publishing of Islamophobia, sort of dealt, I think, very smartly with the fact that it's not just by accident that this happens. There's a political objective to this dehumanization. Edward Said, in all of his treatment over the years, in much the same way, made the point about the fact that there was a point to it. It wasn't just laziness. There was actually a reason why these two communities were dehumanized. I would add that one of the other interesting things about the poll were the fact that people just don't discern. I mean, Arabs are Muslims and Muslims are Arabs, and they're pretty much conflated, one community on top of another. This is not to say that Arab Americans want to, wear ID badges saying, no, I'm not one of them or whatever. It's a question of the fact that both communities historically have been conflated and have been demonized. And it's a tragedy for political reasons, but also for personal reasons that this has been the case. Anything else? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the history of this poll and kind of what your methods were to come about?
Yeah, we've been conducting polls on American attitudes towards Arabs and Muslims now for many years. We've become more granular in sort of not just favorable, unfavorable, but specific attitudes on behavior since 2010. The polls conducted by Zogby Analytics, which is the extension of what used to be Zogby International, polling firm obviously run by my brother John and now my nephew Jonathan. It's an online survey. Their database is enormous, and the demographics pretty much match what used to be available in phone surveys. My brother's company has now moved toward online, as many have, because when you get a 13% telephone response rate, and you're missing out on young people and missing out on non-white communities, you're missing out on significant demographic groups. They do some weighting, because doing the online, you miss some of the older folks, and sometimes they actually do hybrid, where they add some phone in order to compensate for some of the groups that get missed. This was purely online. The numbers, like I said, pretty much track where the, not just on Arabs and Muslims, but because we also did attitude toward Catholics and Chinese and Hindus and stuff, that we matched them up against the Pew numbers, and our numbers pretty much track theirs, and pretty much track the trending line, the downward trending line, actually among all the groups. I mean, it's interesting that Catholic numbers are down. Numbers for a number of communities are down across the board, and Catholics are still highly rated, Jews more highly rated than anybody else, born-again Christians, deep divide between Democrats, Republicans, or again, younger, older. But back, I recall when we first did this in the 90s, we found that attitude towards Muslims and Arabs, we asked the two separately, were almost identical. It was about 45-27 to Hindu and Buddhist numbers. And I took that somewhat with a grain of salt. I assumed that the reason why the numbers were where they were was because people just didn't know. But they had a feel-good attitude toward others. 20 years later, the Hindu-Buddhist numbers haven't changed, but the Arab-Muslim numbers have become inverted, because we've had a 20-year record of very negative attitudes that have tainted the jury pool. And I guess if we could act like a judge and say, don't read the newspapers, you might get a better sample. But that's what we've got right now. The Hindu-Buddhist numbers haven't moved, but the Muslim numbers have become inverted. And it is not as if there's no violence in the Buddhist world or in the Hindu world. Look at India and look at Burma, and you'll see regions in turmoil producing ethnic or religious violence. It is part of the story. It's part of our story as America. But that's pretty much the story of the polling. Okay. Anything else? Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And if you have any other questions, you can feel free to give us a call or email to us. Thank you. Bye-bye.